to hear that your peers were being shot at and killed in the streets, it was deeply shocking.
This is Cold War Conversations. If you're new here, you've come to the right place to listen to first-hand Cold War history accounts. Do make sure you follow us in your podcast app so that you don't miss out on future episodes. The 13th World Festival of Youth and Students was held in July 1989 in Pyongyang, the capital of North Korea. It was the largest international event staged in North Korea up until then. The event took 4 years of preparation by the North Korean government, and they effectively spent a quarter of the country's yearly budget on it. It was declared the largest ever World Festival of Youth and Students, with 22,000 people and 177 countries taking part. This event was the last festival held during the Cold War era, as waves of unrest began to occur throughout Central and Eastern Europe later on in the year. Our guest today is Greg Elmer, who has directed the film The Canadian Delegation, which features longtime activist Chris Frazer, who was handed the task of assembling a Canadian delegation to North Korea. The film follows Frazer and a number of other delegates as they recount their participation in the festival as world events continue to unfold around them. Now, Cold War history is disappearing. However, a simple monthly donation will help keep this podcast on the air. Plus, you'll get a sought-after Cold War Conversations drinks coaster as a thank you, and bask in the warm glow of knowing that you are helping to preserve Cold War history. Just go to coldwarconversations.com/donate. If a financial contribution is not your cup of tea, then you can still help us by leaving written reviews wherever you listen to us, as well as sharing us on social media. We're on Twitter @ColdWarPod, and just search for Cold War Conversations in Facebook. Today's episode is hosted by our co-host Peter Ryan, and I'm delighted to welcome Greg Elmer to our Cold War conversation.
It was a festival that brought together youth and student groups from around the world and different constituencies. Usually student unions, student associations from different countries would organize delegations that would attend these festivals that, again, would happen every 4 years. But what ended up happening, particularly in the 1950s, I believe it was with a festival that was held in Finland, I believe, that the festival started to kind of moved away from perhaps some of the anti-fascist and kind of peaceful rhetoric and goals and agendas and slogans. And the festival started to become more aligned with the Soviet Union. So it got caught up in the Cold War, essentially. Festivals happened every 4 years. And what's so fascinating about the festival or the festivals is that they really embody the politics of the time. So there were festivals in the early 80s that were very much focused on questions of South African apartheid, for example. Prior to that, there were festivals held in a lot of East Bloc capitals that were very much focused on issues of peace and nuclear war and the like. So I think that's what really captured my imagination from the beginning when I started to think about a new project about 6 or 7 years ago. Is that the festival in 1989 in Pyongyang, North Korea, or the DPRK as it's called, was really probably the last Cold War, if you will, festival. And so it really marked a turning point in the history of the festival, or at least the festivals that got caught up in the Cold War rhetoric from the 50s onward.
Greg, can you talk a little bit about why it was significant that this festival in particular was held in North Korea, in Pyongyang? What was different markedly about this one versus the previous iterations?
Well, as I just alluded to, a lot of the festivals in the 70s, in the 80s, were held in places like East Berlin, in Poland, in Romania, and in Moscow. So they really became festivals hosted behind the so-called Iron Curtain, if you will, that were really Soviet Union dominated, if you will. But by the late 1980s, you have the period of glasnost that emerged in the Soviet Union. You had the nuclear meltdown in Chernobyl. So you had a series of events that were happening in the Soviet sphere of influence or within the Soviet Union that really kept them quite busy and at the same time were draining their financial resources. So the festival became caught up in these world events, or particularly the events in the Soviet Union, and the Soviet Union wasn't willing to host it themselves. A lot of other East European countries didn't have the cash and the time to do it. So North Korea at the time was really engaged in a battle of wills with the South, and continues to be, of course, with, of course, the United States and the Americans' allies, including Canada, of course. And the issue that predominated, and I think really led the North Koreans to want to host the 1989 festival was the battle over who would host the 1988 Summer Olympics, which in common parlance is now referred to as the 1988 Seoul Summer Olympics. So prior to 1988, during this period of glasnost, in this political environment that I'm kind of painting a picture of, the North Koreans thought, well, during this period of glasnost, maybe now is the time to approach South Korea and vice versa, to suggest that they should co-host the Olympic Games that were scheduled for 1988. And so there was a series of conversations, and then of course those conversations turned into recriminations, and ultimately the North did not host any events. And so the 1989 World Festival of Youth and Students, if you watch my film, for example, or if you see other clips that are hosted on YouTube and elsewhere, it looks like an Olympic Games. They're like the delegations walk into a stadium, they see themselves in the stadium. So it was their, meaning the North Koreans, chance to kind of prove to the world and the neighbors to the south that they could host just as successful events as the 1988 Seoul Olympics were.
And Greg, something that really struck me in the documentary was when somebody alluded to the fact that the North Koreans had actually constructed a lot of facilities in anticipation of co-hosting the Olympic Games in 1988. And this was a way that they were able to make use of those resources, effectively sweating the assets.
Yes, a tremendous amount of resources, including an Olympic village, which is where the delegates stayed. Swimming pool, Olympic-sized swimming pool, cycling venue, and of course an absolutely ginormous stadium that I can't even remember, like well over 100,000 people could fit in the stadium. It's one of the largest stadiums in the world. So absolutely. A couple of people that I spoke to were speculating on the amount of money that went into building that infrastructure and what kind of draw that had on the North Korean economy. I subsequently read some political economists and historians' perspectives on whether or not, and arguments about whether or not that giant expenditure was a contributing factor to subsequent severe economic problems in the north that led to drought and a lot of deaths as well in North Korea. Yeah.
About that stadium, it's interesting because I believe, based on another documentary I saw recently, it was the site of the world's largest professional wrestling show in history.
That everything is big. The North Koreans like to put on big, flashy events, and the 1989 festival did not disappoint on that on that count.
No, that's for sure. So one of the things that I wondered about as I was watching the documentary was this happened in 1989. This took place 32 years ago. What prompted you to decide to make this documentary back in the late part of the 20-teens?
In 1989, I was about 21 years old. I was involved in student politics, first out in Vancouver and then here in Toronto. And also I spent some time, I think I came into a little bit of money. I think I overlapped in jobs and was paid twice for a number of weeks, which was really nice for a 21-year-old to have a couple $1,000s in their pocket. And, at the time I was watching television and watching news like many of us were. And there was some really crazy stuff going on in places like Berlin, and the wall was coming down, and again, the world was changing, right? If we use that kind of Western lens and look at the Cold War as a defining period of my generation, that was just captivating for me. I had the resources, I had the time, and I traveled throughout Germany, East Germany, straight through to a number of other Eastern European countries as well. So I've always been fascinated, I think, because of that trip. At the same time, like earlier that summer when the festival was going on, I was busy with work, but I had heard through people that I worked with that this festival was being organized. For whatever reason, I didn't go. And I think in retrospect, given my experiences in Eastern Europe and a lot of the resurgence and interest over North Korean politics as being one of the last few remnants, if you will, national examples of the Cold War, I started to strike up conversations with some people I knew, some friends, some student kind of activist friends and student union friends. And when they started to tell me stories, I just thought, okay, this is just too much to pass up, and I started to research and produce the film.
And it's a really good thing that you did, because it brings a side of the Cold War out that I think has been, quite frankly, underreported, and that's perhaps some of the youth activism going on in Western countries like Canada. Maybe you could talk a little bit about the Canadian delegation itself. What type of a mix of people was it? I was struck immediately by the fact that you, as one of the interviewees stated, you had people all the way from the Young Communist League to the Young Conservatives, which I found incredibly fascinating that there was that mix, because around that time I personally was a member of the Young Conservatives at the university I attended, and it immediately impacted me from the standpoint that this wasn't just a group of perhaps people with a certain political orientation. You had voices from across the spectrum.
Yes, that's true. I think that the Canadian Federation of Students were probably one of the main catalysts for organizing a delegation. As I referred to earlier, there had been previous delegations that had been organized by various entities and associations across Canada. Sometimes it was farmers groups, sometimes it was trade unions, sometimes it was the Communist Party, and sometimes it was student union groups. So it seemed to be that in the kind of research that I'd done was always a coalition of groups. Now, 1989 is a particularly interesting, coalition of groups that put together, that constituted the delegation, if you will. There were a lot of interesting, complicated things going on in Quebec amongst student organizations. I think the Canadian Federation of Students and student groups outside of Quebec were really interested in bringing Quebec students into the national organization. having more power at that time. This is, of course, a time where as you know yourself, the Conservative Party was in power, had been in power in Ottawa. So there was a stronger, I think, push to have a national voice amongst the youth and students across Canada. It's not as pronounced today, or hasn't been for a number of years, if not decades, in my opinion. And anyway, so that was kind of the mood at the time. There was also, I think, some of the first forms of what we're seeing today as well, of Indigenous activism, particularly Indigenous student activism, and I think that came out of the mid '80s onwards, out of a wave of Indigenous youth entering the university system like we had not seen before in Canada. And the Mulroney government was at first quite supportive, but started to pull back some support for Indigenous students. And so that sparked a lot of protests and a lot of interest amongst Indigenous communities and students in particular across Canada. So they were deeply involved in organizing and participating in the Canadian delegation. And then the last major organization that played a pivotal part was the Young Communist Party of Canada. Just like all other related organizations around the world, and of course, most importantly in the Soviet Union, were facing an identity crisis. They're losing their funding, they're losing their membership, they're losing their identity. So you can see there's an agenda on the part of Indigenous students. There was an agenda on the part of the Canadian Federation of Students and student activists. There was an agenda on the part of Quebecois students. And the Young Communist League also had an agenda, right? Their agenda was to refashion themselves. And I think they played a very important role in kind of solidifying this kind of, if you will, if I can borrow a phrase, this kind of rainbow coalition of students and youth from across Canada.
How big was the delegation? How many people from Canada attended?
Roughly around 75.
I will say, watching the movie, looking at I think they had a couple of buses that were taking the Canadian delegation back and forth between the events. So, I would say probably 75 was a good estimate. It wasn't a small group of people. When I heard the delegate from Vancouver talking about their trajectory to get from Vancouver to Pyongyang, I actually felt exhausted just listening to the description about all the stops that they need. I think it was, they went to Vancouver to Montreal to Gander, Newfoundland to Moscow, a couple of more stops somewhere in the Soviet Union before they got to Pyongyang. But I have to say that the description of the flights going from Moscow into Pyongyang with people sitting on the floor of the planes was literally the stuff of like a Chevy Chase vacation movie.
That's when we talk about it. There's a couple things. That sequence actually came to get, like, I don't even know if I needed to edit that sequence together. It kind of edited itself, and it was so funny because each of the delegates that I ended up interviewing that were included in the film, it was like they were finishing each other's sentences, right? And that's how, when you watch the film, that's how it kind of rolls out. But it's like they huddled together the day before and swapped notes about what they were going to say about the trip there because it was so fresh. But for me, it was really, you also get what I tried to capture in that sequence when they're traveling, as you said, through all these different legs with all these different stops, is the youthful energy, of course, the anticipation, the excitement, but also the exhaustion, the bizarreness, they're going down a rabbit hole almost. So I tried to kind of capture all these different stages, emotional stages, before they even entered into kind of North Korean airspace, right? So, but I think that they got a sense of what they were in for when they stopped in Gander. And the reason why most people, almost everyone today, stops in Gander is to refuel, right?
Yeah.
um, particularly kind of chartered or small jets, of course, corporate jets. But they were forced to stop in Gander because that was the only place that the government would permit flights that were intended to go to or through the Soviet Union. So it was a security provision. So.
Upon arrival in North Korea for the festival, after what looked like, quite frankly, a planes, trains, and automobiles trip, and it looked like, frankly, a lot of fun. I remember they were talking about how, I think it was the Cuban delegation brought out the musical instruments and effectively ran a party for the flight into North Korea. Did you get a sense about how the delegates saw or felt about the accommodation, the food, the reception that they got once they arrived in Pyongyang?
I don't think people really talk much about the food or the accommodation. I got a sense of it. It wasn't a particular strong memory. No one really offered that up in my conversations with them, but I did notice again through a lot of the kind of found footage and shared footage that I worked through in putting the film together, that there were a lot of small food stands. It was very much like a music festival.
Yeah.
I don't really know how much they actually ate. I think there was a fair bit of drinking going on. If you look closely, I think that the beers are well known brand. I'm not going to repeat what the brand are, which is interesting given where that was happening, and that most of the people there were underage, or a good portion were underage at least. So there's that. It was a big party for sure. I don't think people slept very much, and I think there was a lot of sex as well. So it was a real kind of coming of age experience, if you will, for a lot of the delegates. Yeah.
Yeah, and it's a good thing that they had that demonstration with the microphone that one of the organizers had ventured to put together. I'll let the people who are listening to Cold War Conversations watch the movie, and they'll get a better sense of that. It certainly, though, I think was apropos in terms of some of that activity. Now, one of the things that really I loved about the movie, Greg, was the fact that you focused on 5 or 6 people who were effectively the main players, the cast of players for this doc. How did you select those particular individuals? Was it difficult to track them down, or were they willing participants once you contacted them?
Mm-hmm. It took a while to track people down. I wanted to have a good spread of people, experiences, and backgrounds. I wanted a diversity of voices. I wanted a diversity of opinions, because obviously it's if you were to tell people you went to the DPRK or North Korea today, people might be suspicious of you. And people did this when they were 20, some teenagers. So some people I approached were very hesitant. They were in jobs where they felt that maybe that they would be looked upon with some suspicion, perhaps rightly or wrongly, wrongly in my opinion. But I started with the people that I knew. I started at least pre-interviewing with the people that I knew from when I was a student activist. But my producer, the producer that I was working with at the time, at the beginning of the film at least, he said, "No, I don't think you should start with what you know, Greg. You should start with one of the main organizers, people that you haven't met." And so I ended up starting with, and for other reasons as well, the organizer who was associated with the Young Communist League, with the Canadian Communist Party, and his name is Chris Frazer. And I don't think I knew that he was the organizer for a while, or even when I went to interview him. But he was quite a captivating character, and for those folks who I hope see the film, they'll see that the film really kind of is really told through his experience, both in the past and in the present day as well. But as an organizer, as one of two or three chief organizers, he was able to point me to other people as well, people who I hadn't tracked down, to talk about the inside politics of all the different delegation groups, the mechanics of how the whole thing worked, and many other components that are in the film as well.
But that raises an interesting question. Just when you mentioned that Chris had put you in touch with some of the other folks or pointed you in the right direction, have they kept in touch with each other over the years? Has the network that they had perhaps formed in 1989 stood the test of time?
I don't think they're closely in touch, but they all know each other very well. I think that they were in touch for a number of years afterwards. I'm going to say about 10 years afterwards. And I know a number of them kind of bump into each other now and again. And as someone who was kind of on the somewhat involved in student politics at the time, I would say, 95% of the people that I approached almost immediately trusted me, and were quite excited about telling this story. I only had one participant, and I don't want to use their name, who in the film was a little hesitant. I had one person pull out. I had 2 or 3 people kind of metaphorically slam the phone down on me, so to speak, like, no, I don't want to have anything to do with this. But ultimately, I think people were quite excited, were very open with me about their experiences and their confusion, both when they were there and their confusion about how they were feeling about it in the present tense as well, whether or not their participation was a good thing or not, whether or not Canada sending a delegation was a good thing or not. All those things were kind of up for grabs, and I think were well represented in the film as well.
And you touch on something there that I would really like to explore. And that was, as you're watching the documentary and you're listening to the stories that are being described over some of the footage, over some of the photos, I got a sense that once they were on the ground, that a number of the delegates were a little bit uneasy. They were a little bit uncomfortable. I believe one mentioned that they were concerned. They were starting to realize that perhaps maybe they were part of a broader propaganda experiment, for a broader propaganda tool. Mm-hmm. Did you get that same sense as well, Greg, as you were interviewing the various people for the film?
Very much so. I don't think there was a single person I interviewed who didn't know that after they had arrived in Pyongyang, that they were there to be shown off, that there was yet another agenda. Like earlier, we were talking about the agendas from the Canadian delegation. Well, there were multiple agendas going on in the DPRK, at the festival, of course. There are many others that we don't even have time to get into now. There was of course, a Soviet or a glasnost and agenda that was going on. There was the Olympic agenda on the Korean Peninsula as well. But yeah, I think before they went there was like, well, sure. Well, I think there was a certain kind of a naive kind of left solidarity. Yes, we should go. Why shouldn't we go? We don't know a lot about what's going on. At the time, there wasn't as much of if demonization is, maybe that's a bit of a strong word, but there certainly is some very heavy criticism and deep suspicion, if not fear, of the DPRK in Canada and from the West today, for many reasons. But at the time, it wasn't as pronounced. It was still there for sure. I think it was more of before they left, it was more like a deep curiosity. But yes, absolutely, you're right, Peter. When they arrived, they thought they were going there to participate in a festival, that they were going to go there and witness a show and participate in a big show, if you will. And then, as I said before, they all soon realized that they were on the show as much as they were there to watch a show unfold.
What were some of the stories in particular you heard that marked you the most, that you found the most impactful from the delegates who were attending the festival in Pyongyang?
Much of this didn't make it into the film, and there are other films that document this better. But there were participants there was a delegation sent, a very small delegation sent from South Korea. And one of the Canadian delegates became very involved in the politics around the South Korean delegation's participation in the North. The South Korean state, of course, and government were very unhappy that students from the South had gone to the North. And they made it very clear that they were going to face a very serious repercussions upon returning to South Korea. So a number of the Canadian delegates, and one in particular who's in the film, he was one of the catalysts and participants of a walk that was organized, a peace walk, meant to support and work, stand in solidarity with with the North Koreans, but also the South Korean students who were really going out on a limb, who were really, their agenda was one of really trying to foster a more genuine, open-ended conversation about reunification and peace on the peninsula and denuclearization of the peninsula as well. So that's a story that unfortunately I wasn't able to really tell fully, or even in a small part. But that really stuck out for me. I think it also stuck out for me because it's an ongoing story. It's a sad story. It's a story that continues. There's no resolution. But I think what I tried to capture in the film is the long-term impact that this festival had on the Canadian delegation. I think I could certainly go on at length and talk about how, in fact, it did have a very important impact in South Korea. And I heard many stories to that effect when I screened the film a couple years ago at the DMZ Film Festival in South Korea, literally a rock's throw from the border. But yeah, I think for me, the stories that were told were ones that went through the decades, right? That the impact of the confusion, the naivete, the uncertainty, the participation, the feeling that the delegates were participating on something that was representing what was happening in the world at that time. It was like a world stage, world defining event, kind of the end of the Cold War, at least how they thought of it at the time. I think is something that has really stuck with all the delegates and has really stuck with me as well. And again, unfortunately, the kicker to all that is that, as I said before, that the Korean Peninsula remains caught in the Cold War, even though at the time the Canadian delegation were really hoping, many of them, if not all of them, were hoping that this was one of many events, if you will, that was happening in communist countries around the world that was leading to an opportunities for peace and more openness to the West. Yeah.
It was interesting when you interviewed all the different characters or all the different participants in the documentary about what it was like coming home. And there was one gentleman in particular that really struck me when he said he came back and it was like for the first 3 weeks, it was like it was surreal. It was a dream, and he wouldn't talk about it to anybody. And then finally he said to his parents, okay, I'm ready to talk about this now. And it struck me that really was quite almost a life-altering experience that they all had participated in, and each one of them processed it differently. And, even down to a personal level, I thought it was great. And one of the happy good news stories was that there was one lady who actually met somebody that she married on the trip, which I thought was wonderful as well.
Talk about life-altering experiences. And I think she talks about how at their wedding they named each of the tables at their wedding reception for cities that were significant in their lives.
Yeah.
And they put a number of their friends at the Pyongyang table.
The investment bankers at the Pyongyang table.
I've been to their house on a number of occasions, and you look around and they have a lovely family, a lovely home, and great careers and everything. And you think, this all began in in the DPRK. There are a lot of firsts. There, as I alluded to before, a lot of first sexual experiences, first drinking parties, first. I don't know how to explain. Even now, I have a hard time finding the words to explain that space for them, right? Because they didn't go there to party. They didn't go there to find their husbands or their partners or to get inebriated, right? I think they went there because they felt that it was important, and that there was that feeling that we need to go as a delegation. We need to represent Canada. We can play a role in how the world is unfolding, how the world is changing. And they did play a part at the festival. They were significant. They made a significant contribution to the conversation and the debates that were ongoing at the festival in 1989.
One of the things that really struck me, or one of the things that I thought was fascinating about the Canadian delegation, was the fact that there was a certain point where they felt that they needed to make a statement about what was happening in China in terms of the student repression that was going on in 1989, Tiananmen Square specifically. I think for me, that was probably the point of tension in the movie that really hit home the most. And it's one of those ones where you find yourself gripping the side of the chair because you're not sure what's going to happen next. Greg, can you talk a little bit about what happened and how, when you were interviewing the delegates, they recollected it? Were there any particular nuances that came back to them, especially about what that episode entailed?
In 1989, the summer of 1989, when the news reports first started to come out, a few of which I use in the film, that there were mass demonstrations led largely by students in the streets of Beijing and other places around China. There was a real kind of call to arms in Canada as well. I remember participating in some of those protests in Vancouver. But those protests happened across the country, and they were very emotional. 1989 was the summer of 1989. To hear that your peers were being shot at and killed in the streets, it was deeply shocking, I think, for Canadian students. I think we led a very sheltered life in Canada. I think there were many things that we deeply in the delegates deeply believed in around accessibility, the importance of the education, open education, liberal education, and so on. But this was on an entirely different register, right? So when the delegation arrived at the festival, people were already intensely politicized and shocked. People, meaning the delegates from around the world, were quite shocked about what had happened. And so that led to a series of conversations that many went well into the night about how and to what extent that different delegations coming together could express their solidarity with students in China. There was a Chinese delegation that went to Pyongyang, but it had been recycled a few times, and they weren't student activists like had come from Canada and other countries around the world. So again, over many dinners and drinks and evenings, well into the night, a number of countries led by Scandinavian and delegations and Canada organized an event. But of course, there was much consternation on the part of the organizers of the Canadian delegates and the delegates themselves, because as we know, North Korea has very close ties with China. They received funding, and they continue to receive very important funding from the Chinese state. So there was a real balance that needed to happen. The Canadian delegation didn't want to necessarily offend the host country, but they couldn't ignore what had happened that summer. So what ensued was, I guess the phrase often used is kind of like a cat and mouse game between different delegates, organizers that were on the ground at the festival trying to organize an event, and different agents from the North Korean government, security agents, and it became quite farcical, the lengths to which the security apparatus in North Korea tried to thwart the efforts of a number of delegations, including a number of the Canadian delegates, to try to make sure that the event wouldn't happen. But it did go forward, and there was a rally and a celebration, and a speaker from, I believe, from Hong Kong was able to stand on stage and talk about what was going on still in China. So that event really kind of marked me when I first heard about it. And when I heard about it, of course, kind of 25, 30 years later, when I made the film. And it just strikes me that it's such a huge contrast to a lot of the politics that we're seeing around the campus politics that we're seeing around China now. That there's a real, this is myself talking, this is my own opinion, but there's a real hesitancy to critique China, Chinese policies on a number of issues, and I think that's a long-lasting debate. That's a debate that needs to go on, and I think that if people saw the film, and again, I encourage people to view the film, they'll see just how remarkably different the relationship between Canada and China was, at least through the eyes and through the voices and the memories of the people that were in the Canadian delegation in 1989.
And thinking about those delegates that attended in 1989, and thinking about the ones that you interviewed, did you find that there was any difference in their world outlook in terms of who they are today versus who they were perhaps back in 1989 when they attended as young? Many of them were leftist idealists. Have they evolved in their worldview and their thinking, even professions that you would associate perhaps with what their activities were in the late 1980s versus where they are today?
I wish I could say people change, but actually no. There's slight differences. But what really struck me when I went to these different locations around in the UK and in the United States and Canada, when I met with former delegates, is that many of them, if not all of them, still have a very strong sense of social justice and around questions of international solidarity. One of the delegates, I met him in his office. He had posters up from a festival a meeting he went to in Moscow in 1987, 1988. I would say that, in addition to the one Indigenous member I interviewed, at least 2 or 3 other delegates were heavily involved in advocating for Indigenous rights in Canada. That was quite interesting. There were small differences, I guess. One delegate probably sees themselves more as a centrist and has been involved in the financial world. Another delegate who was very strongly critical of China is much less so now. But by and large, I was really struck that they are all deeply, deeply committed, socially committed individuals. Yeah.
Your film has been featured at a number of different festivals, and if anybody visits the website, they'll be able to see some of the logos. Very impressive. You mentioned the DMZ festival as an example. Since it's been screened when it came out a few years ago, generally speaking, what's the reaction been like?
Well, let me say first, I was disappointed it didn't screen enough in Canada. What's struck me, especially for a film called The Canadian Delegation, I just thought, oh, wow, it's only going to show in Canada, right? Like, no one in the States is ever going to want to see it. All these kind of cliched expectations were, banging around in my head. But it was very well received, and it internationally. It screened almost exclusively, I would say, internationally. And I think it did so because it is a bit of a generational film. And it's a film about social activists. And I think that festivals that had documentary film festivals that had programmers and decision makers on there that were either my age or found the discussions about social activism and international forms of social activism and Cold War politics. Those are the places that the film screened. So it screened it first screened in Amsterdam. And it was kind of like people were just kind of dumbfounded. And again, it's an unknown history. And when people saw the scale of the event, I think just the pure scale of the event, as I alluded to earlier, it looked like, when you see the film, it looks like the Olympics, right? The size of the event itself and the scale of it, and the parades, the buildings, the celebrations, and whatnot, the imagery, the amount of money that went into it. So I think that there was just this bewilderment of like, where did this come from? There was some kind of initially did this really happen? Like, and at first I think people didn't really believe that it actually happened, and that it was kind of a fake documentary or something. But I think people were really interested in knowing either one or two things. Usually they wanted to know more about the event itself and the politics around it, or they were kind of more nerdy film festival people, and they had questions about, like, how did you ever get that footage from North Korea? Mm-hmm. It was either one or the other, right? In South Africa, the film screened 3 times in South Africa, twice to audiences that were very much steeped in the anti-apartheid era. Yeah. And there was a very strong ANC youth delegate in 1989, very important time for South Africa, of course, coming to almost within a few months before of the end of the apartheid state and the release of Nelson Mandela. Just an incredible, point in the world's history, of course, right? It's happened in early 1990, and so they were very much interested in the participation, the relationship between Canada, South Africa, the solidarity politics that led to good things happening, the end of apartheid in their country. When I've screened it in Canada, it's been more youthful audiences, more kind of reflecting upon what's changed and what hasn't changed. And I think in a kind of an appreciation for some pioneers, frankly, particularly on the part of kind of the left and social activists. There are people who were involved in that festival, who were on film, who were leaders in gay rights, for example, LGBTQ gay rights in Canada. And some of the footage of that, and some of those stories are told very forcefully and emotionally in the film as well.
This is the $1 million question. I've got to ask it. Has the DPRK commented on the film?
Not that I know. Like I said, it did screen in South Korea, and I was well maybe I'll say just quickly when I was going there, I thought actually that literally I'd flown for 16 hours. It was not unlike that kind of flight almost that the delegation went on. I showed up and I was confused and jet lagged, and I had to go straight from landing to the opening ceremonies of the film festival. And I thought it was in downtown Seoul, which is where I booked a hotel, but of course it wasn't. It was literally at the border with the North, so it was about 10 o'clock at night. I hadn't slept for, almost 2 days, and I'm driving in a taxi going north, and literally the signs are saying like Pyongyang, and I'm thinking, where am I going? And I'm also going further and further away from my bed, which is really where I wanted to be, right? Anyway, so I was really, all that to say that it was quite an event to get there. But I wasn't. I was nervous about how it was going to be received, and I was really excited when people approached me after the end of the screening. It screened 3 times, and people talked about. The audience said, "We loved your film because it's not a typical DPRK film made by a Western filmmaker, which is, if I can sum it up, look at this strange place." Look at these funny people. Oh my God, these are dangerous people, right? And there are important reasons behind some of those, I think, approaches, right? But that is almost a uniform approach to storytelling, again, from Westerners when they go to the North Korea. My film was about how the North changed a group of Canadians. Confronted a group of Canadians, their values, their naivete, a bunch of things, their futures, confronted their futures, and I think that the audiences there really appreciated the kind of more nuanced conversation that came out of that in the film, rather than kind of a finger pointing kind of a film, if I can use that expression. But no, I don't think I would probably travel to the DPRK to screen it. There's probably a few too many things that wouldn't make it past the film's censor there. I probably wouldn't screen the film. I wouldn't screen the film in China either, because there's a sequence in there of Tiananmen Square massacre that would not go over well, and I would not ever remove that to screen that film. I wouldn't remove anything from that film. So there it is. Well, I'm not sure if we'll ever have a film reviewer or official comment from the North on the Canadian delegation.
So I said in the last question for you, this was the $1 million question. This will be the $2 million question. Greg, where can the Cold War Conversations listenership find your movie? How can they watch this amazing documentary?
It is. It's on the internet. It's on a film platform called Vimeo, Vimeo. And so if your listeners just go to Vimeo and search The Canadian Delegation, it'll pop up. It's a very small screening fee. I believe it's about $4. And the money is going to help support my next film. But yeah, just Google The Canadian Delegation and my name, Greg Elmer. And you'll be directed to the film, and it's not what you're going to expect. I'll just say that, and it's well worth $4.
It honestly is probably one of the most provocative documentaries I've seen in quite a long time.
Make sure you visit the episode page on our website, where there's videos of the festival, links to the trailer of Greg's film, and links to see the full-length version. Now, this podcast would not exist without our financial supporters, and I want to thank one and all of them for their generous support. If you want to help us, just go to coldwarconversations.com/donate for more information. And you can also join our Facebook group where listeners just like you continue the Cold War conversation. Thanks very much for listening. It is really appreciated. Goodbye.